Today we're going to be talking about progressive Christianity, and we're going to be analyzing it and determining whether or not it is accurate to Christianity as we think it properly ought to be described. Bad start already. Okay, so let's begin with a dictionary definition of progressive Christianity, then we'll get into critiquing it. So it's defined as a contemporary movement focusing on social justice, inclusivity. Man, I don't know what's wrong with my voice today. All right, let's begin with defining progressive Christianity. It's defined as a contemporary movement focusing on social justice, inclusivity, and reinterpreting traditional doctrines through a modern lens, prioritizing questioning over dogma. For instance, it emphasizes Jesus' teachings on love and compassion, viewing the Bible as a guide rather than something that's inerrant, and it often embraces scientific insights. Now, especially that last part, it's like we Catholics can be friendly to that, right? So here, clearly the author of this definition is contrasting progressive Christianity to fundamentalism. But again, Catholics are not going to be fundamentalists, so we're definitely going to agree with the scientific insights part there, at least being in principle open to them. So we've seen that Christianity is true, right? That was the whole point of last semester, right? Is God and then Jesus, right? So theism to Christian theism, that movement there. So now the question is, okay, well, how do we practice Christianity? How do we live it out? And what do we believe about it? Right? How do we accurately represent Christianity? So one such hypothesis is progressive Christianity. We've just seen the definition of that. So the guiding question for us tonight is going to be, does progressive Christianity accurately represent Christianity? Is it something that valid Christians, people that want to call themselves Christians and be faithful to Christianity and the truth, is this something that they can hold? Well, it's hard to kind of use progressive Christian as a label because they can believe many different sorts of things. But I've identified a number here, around 10 features of progressive Christianity that are common to most forms of it. So most progressive Christians will hold to many of these issues we're going to be talking about today. And so we're just going to take things case by case here and issue by issue. There isn't really a logical theme to the presentation tonight. It's going to be basically a grab bag of different progressive Christian positions and then an analysis of them from a biblical perspective, largely. But we'll also look at some church history too. So this presentation would be, for the most part, fully accessible to Protestants as well, right? This isn't just a Catholic presentation. So the first belief of many progressive Christians is denying the fatherhood of God, specifically the label of Father, right, describing God. So, for example, this is expressed in many progressive baptismal formulas, right? So rather than saying, I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, what we see at the end of Matthew's Gospel and what the Catholic Church has done for two millennia, what they'll do is they'll say, I baptize you in the name of the Creator and the Sanctifier, the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sanctifier. Right, so they'll kind of get rid of those gender terms. Now they have multiple reasons for doing this, but the main reason is to kind of get rid of that gendered language, which they view as a reflection of the patriarchy, not of God himself. And so here's kind of the main argument for denying the Father of God, expressed deductively. Gender labels are biologically or materially informed. It is a mistake to assign a biologically informed label to something non-biological. God is pure spirit, so therefore not biological. Therefore, it is a mistake to assign him a gender label. So now we'll get into the classical Christian response to this. So again, this is a valid argument here, right? So then the question is, okay, if all these premises are true, then the conclusion follows logically necessarily. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, which premise here, and there may be several of them, are contentious, are questionable, and then we need to investigate those. So really there's only two controversial premises here, which are the first two. So we'll look at those in depth. So yes, we're going to agree that God is pure spirit and so is beyond gender. So strictly speaking, God does not have a gender, right? In speaking about the divine nature, he is neither male nor female, because again, that relates to organisms. That is a property of biological entities. It's a property of creatures. It's not a property of spirit. Otherwise, there's no way to distinguish between a male or female spiritual being, right? We distinguish male and female beings in general through physical properties, right? And so that's how we distinguish them. Then there can't be that distinction within angelic natures or within the divine nature, anything that's pure spirit. So then the question becomes, well, why do we refer to God as Father? Basically, we refer to him as Father because he reveals himself to us as Father. So we don't invent that for him, right? He describes himself that way to us. And then when he enters into humanity, right, he has the choice to enter in as a male or as a female. And he enters in the person of Jesus of Nazareth as a male. And so throughout the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament, we see that the singular masculine pronoun is used to describe God throughout the entire biblical story. And so if that's how God asks us to refer to him as, and that's how he reveals himself to us, then why would we not use that label, right? Why would we not use his preferred pronoun, right? That's kind of the joke here, right? So people will kind of ask, like, okay, well, if we're going to use God's preferred pronouns, then why not use the preferred pronouns of other human beings, right? If you watched Charlie Kirk's Surrounded video with Jubilee, I'm forgetting who it was. Who's the really annoying one? Parker. Yeah, if you guys know Parker from the Jubilee series, right? Parker was kind of attacking his position there and saying, well, if we're going to use God's preferred pronouns, right, then why can't we use the preferred pronouns of trans people? No, Charlie, obviously very gifted, but not always the best debater when it comes to rigorous issues, right? God rest his soul. And so I think he didn't really kind of represent the conservative, the Christian position for that matter, well there in that exchange. I think what we could say about that here is that the difference between the two is that usually when people use preferred pronouns or when people affirm a gender ideology or a gender transition, they are implicitly at least, but oftentimes explicitly, saying something about the nature of that person, right? So they are, if there is a trans person and say as a male who's presenting himself as female, let's say, then if we affirm him as a female, as a woman, we're affirming his identity as a woman too, right? Usually it's not just politeness, right? Usually it's, no, I affirm you that you have actually made a successful transition and you are now a woman, right? So, but with the divine nature, when we refer to him as Father, we're not actually thinking that he's a male being, right? We understand that he's pure spirit. We're just using that because we have to refer to him somehow, right? We're not going to call him an it, right? So we have to refer him in some personal proper noun there, and that's how he asks to be called. So when we call him Father, there is an implicit understanding that, okay, we're not saying anything about his intrinsic nature. We're just respecting him, and we have to call him something, right? Whereas in the case with the trans person, usually you are affirming that their fundamental nature has changed, or that it was always that, which that would be untrue, right? So and you do have something to call them by, right? Namely, their pronouns that actually and accurately describe them. So I think that the case with God and the case with the trans person is relevantly not analogous in at least a couple of ways. And also, moving on, God's revelation as Father tells us something about him, right? So I don't think he just picks Father arbitrarily. And it's also worth noting that, you can't really fit God in a box, right? So when we call God Father, we're not just thinking that, okay, he only relates to us in a masculine way. So for instance, when he creates us male and female, it says that both men and women are created in the image and likeness of God. So very interesting. Both men and women are in the image and likeness of God. And so that shows that you can't really call God masculine, or you can't really fit him in a box, right? He just reveals himself as Father because his role, right, to us and with us is more akin to that of a father than that of a mother, right? The role that he takes. But he definitely does speak, right, in classically feminine ways as well, right, especially throughout the Old Testament. So yeah, we can't fit him in a box, but that's how he asks us to be called. So that's why we call him Father. And the reason why he even desires to be known parentally or referred to parentally is because of that intimate relationship that he seeks with us, right, which is so different from so many other religions, both ancient and modern, right? Even if you look at Islam, for instance, the idea that God is our Father is scandalous to them. Like, how could you say that about God? He's so much greater than us. How could you assign that role to us that says that we're like him? at all, or that he cares about us in that way. But the fact that we Christians can say that, and then you see elements of that in the Old Testament as well, shows us that God desires to know us intimately as a loving Father. The next issue we'll talk about is women's ordination into the priesthood, right? And we see this in several different Protestant denominations, right? You see women bishops, you see women priests or priestesses, and then ministers too, and more low church denominations, right? You'll see kind of Baptist ministers and preachers that'll be women. So here's the argument, again expressed logically. Men and women are absolutely equal. Any persons that are absolutely equal should be able to exercise equivalent functions. Therefore, men and women should be able to exercise equivalent functions. Therefore, since men can be ordained, women should also be able to be ordained. Right? That's kind of the argument there. So against women's ordination, we're going to say several different things. So the first is that Jesus only chose male apostles, right? He chose the 12 to follow him and to give them authority, because he has disciples both male and female, but he only chooses the 12. He only assigns an office to them. He only assigns 12 apostleship, right? So only 12 get to become apostles. Only 12 get the office of bishop and get those powers of, for example, forgiving sins. And so the argument here basically is that if Jesus wanted to ordain women priests or wanted to give women a divine office in the church, then we would have seen him do that in his earthly ministry. But in fact, we never see him do that. And he had 12 chances with the apostles. But then you have more too with the successors. For example, the successor of Judas Iscariot and then Paul. So they're also granted the status of apostleship, and they're both men still. Now, somebody might say, well, it would have gone against the culture of the time for Jesus to choose female priests, for him to have priestesses. And so therefore, he kind of had to work in that system, and so was never going to, even if he wanted to, ordain women. Now, I think this is problematic on two fronts. First, it's just flatly not true that that was the culture at the time, right? You see in other Greco-Roman contemporary contexts, female priestesses, right? You do see this in ancient Near Eastern culture and Near Eastern culture at that time too. So it's not true, like the precedent had been set for priestesses, and he still chooses not to do that. But secondly, if you were to describe Jesus to somebody, probably the last thing you would say about him is that he followed cultural norms and expectations. This is a guy who completely flipped them on their heads all the time, right? The eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners, even allowing women to participate in his ministry as disciples, getting close to them, holding them in a high regard, and in many other situations too. So yeah, Jesus is more than willing and happy to buck cultural norms whenever he feels that they go against what he wants and go against the will of God. But also, that isn't so alien to that culture as many people would like us to think. This has been continued by the apostolic tradition for over 2,000 years, right? So both Catholics and Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox and Orientals as well, we all still hold that the ordination to the diaconate, to the priesthood, and to the episcopacy, to being a bishop, is reserved for men. So it's been continued for 2,000 years as well. And then also the ontology of a priest, so that is to say the very makeup or nature or essence of a priest, is one that it necessitates the holder of that position to be male. And the reason why is because the priest stands in persona Christi capitis, right? That means in the person of Christ, the head. And so Jesus is male, and so the priest has to therefore be male. So the reason why is because according to the church and according to classical Christian theology, the priest must be male in order to sacramentally represent Christ as the bridegroom. So again, even going back to the Old Testament, but you see this again in the New Testament, especially in Hebrews, we see God's relationship to mankind expressed in spousal terms, right? Spousal and marital imagery is used all the time. And who are the different partners in that marriage? You have us, the church, as the bride, and then you have Christ as the bridegroom. And so if that is going to be the notion here of the relationship between man and God, and the priest is standing in the person of Christ, and Christ is the bridegroom, which is a male role, then it stands to reason that the priest is going to be in that male role. Also this idea that the priest sacrifices, right? The priest is a sacrificial life And normally, as we'll see later on when we look at the roles within marriage, the role of sacrifice is most of the time assigned to men, right? Usually it's men sacrificing for women. So for all these reasons and more, we're going to say that the church, that only males can be ordained to the priesthood, to a divine office, right? So we see it, Jesus only chooses men. It's the apostolic tradition for 2,000 years. That's kind of hard to dispute. The priest has to be male, so not even looking at history, just looking at philosophy and what it means to be a priest. It's going to necessitate being male. Because we don't think that the priesthood in Catholicism and Christianity is just a job. It's not an occupation that you can go in and out of. We think that when one becomes a priest, there's a fundamental transformation that happens to his soul. There's a substantial change such that the old dies and passes away and the new becomes instantiated. And we actually think that the priesthood, the sacrament, confers an indelible mark on the soul. The priest's soul is eternally and permanently changed, such that in heaven or hell, you'll be able to know who was a priest during his time on earth and who wasn't. So it's fundamentally going to be something about the person. Now, oftentimes progressives, when they hear that, they'll say something like, well, Jesus was a particular race, right? He was a first century Palestinian Jew. So why, and if that's Jesus, that's who he is, just like him being male, then why do we not say that, okay, well, all priests, if they all have to be male, why don't they all have to be of that particular ethnicity or race as well? And I think the fundamental response to that, at least my own response to that, I don't know what wiser men than me have said, is that we see God in the Bible assign roles based on gender, as we'll see with head of the household later, but we don't really see him do it based on race, right? Or based on what country you're from. It's normally based on who you are, right? And also I think gender or sex is much more fundamental to one's person than his race, right? I think that one is, and this is controversial, right? Maybe I'll have to backtrack this, but I think that one's sex is an essential property of his, right? I think that's part of his substance. I think that's a substantial property of his. Whereas I think one's race or ethnicity is going to be an accidental property of his, right? I mean, if you take, for example, somebody, let's say with an Arabic background, right, maybe ethnically, and you raise them in the United States, and even if you go like to more generations, right, I think that person will largely be indistinguishable from, let's say, a white person of the same sex. But you wouldn't really see that in terms of gender, right? The differences are just much more poignant and much more plentiful. So, yeah, I think that one is more properly an essential property of a person. And we see this, that God chooses things based on gender when assigning roles, not necessarily ethnicity. And then also, if you look at the tradition of the church, as these apostles die out and the office needs to be fulfilled, they fulfill them with men, right? And at this point, they aren't all the same ethnicity. They're in Northern Africa, they're in Asia, they're in Greece, so they're not all the same race anymore. So clearly, you see at the very early, in the very early decades following Christ, that yeah, they're not viewing race as important or as material for determining ordination, but they still do all the time for sex. And then also, lastly, the church lacks the ability to revise this teaching, right? So this is from a Catholic perspective. So Pope John Paul II, in a document in the mid-90s, writes that the church has no authority whatsoever to confer priestly ordination on women. So I think we've seen 4 powerful reasons here why we can regard women's ordination as impossible or as impermissible. And if you're a Catholic, you're bound to this position by the church. And you may ask, why does it take 1994 years, right, for them to declare it? Well, usually the church declares things in the context of debate and division. And so that's when people really start to question it, is the late 20th century. Before then, it wasn't questioned. So of course, the church is going to make it even more clear. For example, even you look at the Church of England, they don't ordain women to the priesthood until it's either the 90s or the 70s. I think it's the 90s. And they don't ordain women to the episcopacy until the mid-2000s. So this is very recent in church history. This is extremely recent. And so of course, you're going to see powerful statements of late, because nobody ever questioned it before then. Next, we'll look at headship of the household. So again, we'll start with the argument. I think this is the last time we do this, but they'll say men and women are absolutely equal. Any persons that are absolutely equal should be able to exercise equivalent functions. Therefore, no partner in marriage has a leadership role over the other. It's kind of the argument there. So we'll also argue that any scriptural verse that implies otherwise, that implies that one does have a headship or leadership role over the other, is a product of first century misogynistic culture rather than divine decree. So that's the argument, is that there is no leadership role in marriage. Or at least if there is, it could be held by either one. It doesn't necessarily have to be reserved for men. So let's first talk briefly about men and women and their relationship to each other. So the Christian view of men and women is that men and women are equal in dignity while being different in role. And this is so funny because this is so different from both the ancient and modern worlds. It's different from the ancient world with respect to that first contention there, or belief, and different from the modern world with respect to the second. So Christianity is just this kind of island of goodness and of right doctrine and teaching in the midst of an ever-shifting world, right, of values and what they hold to be true. So in the ancient world, it was pretty scandalous, right, for Genesis to claim that both men and women are created in the image of God. That's very, very important. Jordan Peterson makes this point, is that women are not created in the image of man. They're created like men in the image of God. So they have that full and equal dignity that men do. And then Paul affirms this as well in Galatians. So men and women are on a completely equal playing field, something that's very, very rare for ancient religions. You don't really see it in too many other places. And this is so important to the dignity of women in Christianity that the eminent sociologist Rodney Stark credits the rapid rise in Christianity in the first few centuries in the Roman Empire partly to the advancements for women's stature that Christianity afforded, because they didn't hold them to be second-class citizens like the Greco-Romans did. But at the same time, we think that men and women are different in role. They have different roles to play, right? At least in the church and in the household, but perhaps also in society as well. I'll leave that question unanswered for today. But they have different roles. And here's one way we can see why. So here's what the Bible has to say on the headship of the male in the household. Wives, submit to your husbands. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. So the head of a wife is her husband. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be harsh with them. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, so even if they're not Christians, that they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. So this is interesting, right? Even if they're not Christians, you still have to be subject to them. So clearly there's a leadership role here for men. But, okay, now given that men are leaders, what does it actually look like? Well, I only gave you the beginning of Ephesians 5. Let's look at the whole thing. Be subject to one another. It's a different translation here. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Jesus Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. As the church is subject to Christ, so let wives also be subject in everything to their husbands. Now we get to what that leadership looks like. So leadership has been defined and declared. Now it's expanded upon. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Even so, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no man ever hates his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason, man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is a profound one, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So Men are leaders in the marriage, but what does that look like? Men or husbands, love your wives as Christ loved his church. How does Christ love his church? By sacrificing himself for it, for all of us. So this leadership is not dominion, it's not tyranny, it's service-based. It's what's called servant leadership. Even Jesus, when he described his own leadership and his own role on earth, he says that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So that's what this leadership looks like. It's leadership for the sake of the service of the family. So it's not tyranny, it's not monarchy, it's not abuse. It's ultimately for the good of the family, and it is ultimately sacrificial. So it's a hard call for both here, because I could imagine a woman wanting to be in charge, right? I want to be in charge, who doesn't? But I could also imagine somebody not wanting to sacrifice and to be served. That's a normal human desire too. So each one is like having something good here while also giving up something as well. So it's very beautiful, right? This complementarian view of the sexes. And that's really kind of the main takeaway here, is that the Christian view of the sexes differs from the modern culture, that the modern culture has an egalitarian view, which says that males and females are equal in all respects, whereas a Christian view is going to be what's called complementarian. So we're going to say, no, they are unequal in certain respects, but those differences are for the sake of complementarity. They're to complement each other such that we're greater than if we were just the sum of our parts. That's the Christian view. Now we'll get into the bulk of the talk today, which is our biggest subject, and then we'll have like some more minor issues afterwards. And this is, of course, going to be marriage equality. So whether or not Christians can affirm same-sex marriage, whether or not it's permissible in a Christian context. So we aren't speaking about the law here at all, because with abortion, there's both a moral and legal dimension to the question of same-sex marriage. Here, we're not talking about the legal aspect of it, just the moral one. So here's what progressive Christians will say about same-sex marriage, gay marriage. Also, when I use the phrase homosexuality here, unless otherwise noted, I refer to it as relations between people of the same sex, right? Not necessarily the desire or the attraction for same sex. If I want to say that, I'll say same-sex attraction. So the progressive Christians will say that the Bible speaks about heterosexual marriage as a way, that's a way of doing things, but not as the way, not as the exclusive and only way of doing things. They'll say that passages that condemn homosexual activity only condemn sexual licentiousness. They never condemn homosexual actions outright. We'll get into all this in more detail. Then they'll say that drawing distinctions between types of romantic love is discrimination, which is immoral, right? Because everyone should be treated equally, they'll say. Here we'll get that famous phrase, love is love. And then they'll also lastly argue that even if the scriptures do condemn homosexual acts outright, that would be an expression of first century norms, not necessarily the law of God. So we'll get into the proof text here, and then we'll see what they'll have to say in response to that, and then how we respond to them in turn. So going back to the Old Testament, then we'll spend the rest of the time in the New. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Looking to Romans. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. The women exchanged natural relations for the unnatural, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in their own persons the due penalty for their error. Moving to 1 Corinthians. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. This kind of gives this famous list of mortal sins here. And then lastly, looking at 1 Timothy, and there are other verses too, there's 9 total, but I thought these were representative. For the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, and then goes on, right? So again, this list of mortal sins, and we see homosexuality there as well. So what is the move then of progressive Christians? So, right, we talked about how they'll say that they condemn licentiousness, but not homosexual action. So what does that actually mean? So they're going to argue that in the ancient world, and especially in that part of the world, they didn't have a concept of a lifelong, loving, and monogamous relationship between persons of the same sex. Right? So instead, the forms of same-sex behavior that were common in the ancient world were oftentimes prostitution or ones with significant age gaps between the male and between one male and the other, temple sexual rituals or exploitative master-slave relationships. So a master having it with his slaves, they didn't really have the context of a committed, loving relationship. So therefore, when the Bible condemns homosexuality, it's condemning it in that context. They're not really condemning the homosexual part. They're condemning all the rest of that bad stuff. But they're not really condemning homosexual actions in principle. So if you could have a homosexual relation that's abstracted from all that clearly wicked stuff, then maybe that would be permissible. Maybe the Bible isn't talking about that. That's kind of how the argument goes. So they'll also look at that specific word that's used in 1 Corinthians. So when it says neither idolaters, drunkards, nor homosexuals, and they'll take issue with that word homosexual there, or rather the translation of it. And they'll say, there's no way that what Paul wrote there is homosexual. And we know this because, one, it's a bad translation, and two, the word homosexual didn't become a word until the mid-19th century in Germany, right? So clearly, Paul couldn't have been using that word in that context. But let's actually look and see, how it should be translated. So the Greek word there is arsenokitai. That's the Greek word, arsenokitai. Now let's look at what it actually means. So even if arsenokitai should not be translated as homosexual, it still condemns homosexual acts when you look at how it should be translated. So the most literal translation of it is men who lie with men. Right? Another common translation is active or passive sexual partners in same-sex sexual acts. So even if it's not using the word homosexuality, clearly it's talking here about a reality that's very close to it, that's referring to the behaviors of men in that context. So fine, we don't have to use the word homosexual, and most Bible translations don't, but you're still going to get this idea that what we now call homosexuality is going to be impermissible from a biblical worldview. Now, just to be fair and honest and to steelman the position of the progressive Christian, what they'll say is that it's ambiguous, right? Arsenokitai is ambiguous whether or not it relates to just same-sex relations in general or specific kind. But those words there, right, men who lie with men, that seems pretty general. That seems to kind of cover everything. Or active or passive male partners, that seems to cover everything. It doesn't mention anything about a slave-master context or prostitution, just the act of two persons of the same sex. So I think it is sufficiently broad. But even if that's not, even if there's any doubt there, then let's not look at one verse, but let's look at all of them. So every single time that homosexuality is discussed in the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, it's discussed in a negative manner. Every single time. I think that's a pretty strong argument, right? If people are going to say this is permissible, then why is, no matter what context it's in, it's always negative, right? I think that speaks to the fact that the negativity is being ascribed to that actual act itself, because that is the common denominator here. But we'll move on. So in addition to having a case against homosexuality and homosexual marriage, there is a strong positive case for heterosexual marriage. And if that's how marriage is, then it's going to preclude everything that's contradictory to that and that's incompatible with that. So for example, going back to Genesis, we see, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So this is speaking to Adam and Eve and speaking, of course, about them. And at this point, Adam and Eve are representatives of humanity. So that does speak to this idea that, this is the way and not just a way. Jesus again goes and quotes them in Matthew's gospel when he says, basically quoting it, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Literally quotes it. So when Jesus talks about marriage, and when he's asked about marriage, he talks about it in this way, explicitly naming males and females. He doesn't say, and one shall leave his father and mother and be joined to another that has done that, but a man to his wife. So that is the model here. He could have made it more broad, but he's specific. And so, again, kind of that parallel to what the Bible says about homosexuality, what does it say about heterosexuality in the context of marriage? Or what does it say about marriage in general? So, again, from Genesis to Revelation, when marriage is discussed in a positive light, it is in the context of the union between one man and one woman. Every time. So, again, you see that perfect parallel. Every time that homosexuality is mentioned in the Bible, it's always in a negative context. And every time marriage is mentioned in the Bible, it's always in the context of a man and a woman. So if you put those two pieces together, even if you think neither one is strong enough on its own, you get this cumulative case for marriage being one thing over the other. And now I mentioned here that it's discussed in a positive light because the Bible does mention polygamous marriages, right? But the interesting thing is that the Bible has what's called a subtle critique of polygamy. That every time it discusses a polygamous marriage, it always falls apart and bad things always happen. Every single time you have polygamy, you have tons of other bad things, and you have the marriage falling apart. And so this is what's known as the Bible's subtle critique of polygamy. But depending on how you want to translate a particular verse in, I think, Deuteronomy, you can make it a case that the Bible explicitly condemns polygamy as well, not just implicitly critiques it. But in any case, it's always between one man and one woman, or at least between men and women. And then we've got here, right, that even if the Bible condemns homosexuality only 9 times, because it is only 9 times, if the standard of marriage is heterosexual, which it is, and if fornication is a sin, then that means that the impermissibility of same-sex relations is going to be implied, and is going to be entailed by that view of marriage. So people will say, oh, Jesus didn't talk about like same-sex relations. Well, even if he didn't mention it, well, one, we don't know what he did and didn't talk about, right? We don't have all his words, right? And John explicitly says that. But 2, even if he doesn't mention it directly, he mentions it indirectly. So Jesus also doesn't condemn bestiality. Does that mean that we think that's permissible? Of course not. But he talks about not fornicating, and he talks about marriage. And so everything that's not that norm, one man and one woman, is going to be condemned. Whether it's homosexuality, pedophilia, bestiality, adultery, any of it else. It's all going to fall under that umbrella term of fornication, if we have a proper view of marriage. This is unanimously agreed upon by the church fathers and is held through all of the splits of all the different divisions of Christianity throughout the ages. So the view that same-sex marriage is permissible in a Christian context isn't seen anywhere in Christendom until the latter half of the 20th century, literally 7 years ago. Before 7 years ago, nobody ever postulated this, that this could be something that's okay. So for over 1900 years, think of all the divisions, all the splits, right? Oriental Orthodox from the rest of the church, Catholic from Eastern Orthodox, Protestant from Catholic, and the dozen different Protestant divisions. Every single time you have a split, no one even questions that. That's always there. So if something is going to survive, even the heretics don't even claim this. So much theological division in the last 2,000 years. And yet this is not one of those pieces. So I think if it's something that all Christians have held from the beginning, there's a pretty good chance that's part of Christianity, because they literally debate and disagree about pretty much everything. There's so few things that they don't disagree about. I'll just cover a couple more quick objections. Some will charge that we're discriminating if we say this, right? So one Anglican bishop, when he's making his case for why the Church of England should embrace gay marriage, he says that, why are you drawing distinctions between marriage? That you have marriage between Christians, you have marriage between 2 people of different sexes, you have same-sex marriage, as if, and he kind of emotionally uses this language analogy of an airplane, where he says it's like you've got first class, you've got comfort plus, and you've got economy, right? That's not how we think about marriage. He says marriage is marriage is marriage, and that's that. And then, of course, the liberal audience roars, right, and applause. But I wonder if he'd say that about a marriage between an adult and a child. If he wants to say marriage is marriage is marriage, right? So clearly he thinks that there's distinctions as well. So it's just so disingenuous that he uses that line when clearly he's going to think that some are wrong and others are okay. And I don't think he believes in polygamy either. So it's like, I don't know why he used that phrase. I mean, he doesn't even believe that himself, but it's just very emotionally driven. So yes, we are being discriminative here, right? We are discriminating here. But the problem with, a lot of people in modern culture is that they think that discrimination is inherently wrong, but that's not true. Discrimination is not intrinsically evil. What's intrinsically evil is unjust discrimination. To discriminate unjustly is evil. For example, if I were a fire chief and I was hiring for the position of a fireman, and let's say you had a white tough black guy and then a white tough guy and then a black tough guy, right? Imagine you had that, and I said, oh, I'm choosing the white guy over the black guy. Well, yeah, you're discriminating, you're noting a difference and acting based on that difference. That seems to be unjust, because that doesn't seem to be relevant to the job of being a fireman. But if you had two candidates come in, one is a big tough guy, and the other is like a scrawny guy, he's 6 foot tall and 105 pounds, it's like, you're not gonna be able to like lift somebody out. You're not gonna be able to respond quickly. You're not gonna be able to carry the hose. So yeah, I'm going to choose the strong guy over you. No one's gonna say that's unjust, but yet he discriminated, he noted a difference. So what we wanna condemn here is unjust discrimination, not just. And so if this is ordained by God, then while we are discriminating, it's plausibly not unjust. So some will say that Jesus never condemned homosexual activity, and so it must not be important. This has been said a lot in the last half century, but there's a rising star, if you pay attention to politics, any of you, in Texas politics. His name is James Tallarico. He's now the Democratic nominee for the senior Senate seat. He's going to challenge whoever the Republican nominee is. And he's in seminary right now, but a Protestant sect, and super, super progressive, very, very liberal. And people ask him, hey, you're a Christian, why do you support this? Now he goes all in on leftism. Like, he basically says that Christianity supports not only gay marriage, but transgender ideology as well. So he goes all in. And he says, people talk about gay marriage and its sinfulness. I have a hard time saying that if Jesus didn't talk about something, that's a part of our faith, or that's an essential part of our faith. That's what he goes around saying. And he's getting millions of views on YouTube. So a lot of people are buying into this. And just won a primary in the second largest state in the country. So this is big. But again, I kind of hinted at this earlier. Number one, John at the end of his gospel says, there is so much more that Jesus said and did, but I could not write them all down here. I suppose that if they had all been written down, all the words and deeds of Jesus, we couldn't even fill every book in the entire world. So yeah, we don't have all the words of Jesus. So how are you going to say that because Jesus didn't talk about something, it's not okay, or it is okay, when we don't know everything that he said, right? There's no way to make that argument. Second of all, nobody really believes that, right? For instance, Jesus never condemned animal abuse, but I'm sure the progressive Christian is going to stand against animal abuse. So it seems that Jesus saying something about morality is neither necessary nor sufficient criterion for that being considered part of the moral code, or at least that it's not necessary. It's definitely sufficient, but it's not necessary at all. Some will say that, well, we don't follow the Bible in God's law on mixed fabrics, right? It talks about the impermissibility of mixing fabrics, so therefore, why should we follow it on the teaching relating to marriage and sexuality? Well, again, I think that this person is confusing the different types of God's law in the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, you see different types of law. For example, you see liturgical law, you see laws for how to govern the nation of Israel. So maybe we can call that state law. You see ceremonial law, so laws governing behavior in ceremonies and in rituals. And then you have moral law, good and evil, right and wrong. So the classical Christian interpretation of this is going to be that the use of mixed fabrics is going to be part of ceremonial law. It's not going to be part of an enduring moral law that reflects the nature of God, and that's to be held by all Christians at all times. So the ceremonial law of Israel is meant to be held by the Israelites, not meant for all people at all times. And how do we know that the teaching on marriage and sexuality is going to be part of moral law, whereas the other is going to be part of ceremonial law that's only meant for the Jews? Well, one way of knowing that, I think, I'm hesitant to say common sense, but I kind of feel like common sense should be employed here. But in addition to that, if we want something more robust, whether or not it's talked about and affirmed by the New Testament authors or by Jesus is also going to be salient here. And the New Testament doesn't mention mixed fabrics, and indeed condemns that part of the old law, or says it's no longer applicable. We see this with food laws as well. But it does carry forth the teachings on sexuality and marriage. And so that tells us that this is for the new covenant as well. This is for all people, not just for the Israelites. Some will allege that these teachings are products of the ancient world. Again, we have to ask ourselves, do you believe that the Bible is the Word of God? If you don't, then you're treading dangerously towards not being a Christian. In that case, we have to get back to proving Christianity to them. Why God, why Jesus, right? But if you are going to believe that it's from God, then regardless of what the culture thought at the time, this is what God thinks, if these are his scriptures. So that's not going to work either. Some will also say that we know more about homosexuality now than we knew then. That may be true. That is true. So they may have thought it was always a choice back then to have those attractions, whereas we're pretty clear now, the science is pretty clear that it's not a choice for a lot of people, right? Also, if you're Catholic, you have to hold that, depending on how you think about the catechism, but the catechism teaches that it's not a choice, that they don't choose their condition. But I think the science is very clear on that they don't. And closeted conservatives that are embarrassed and that get outed and that are so ashamed of that part of themselves. I mean, they're definitely not choosing that. That's kind of the strongest evidence to me, apart from the scientific. But even if that is true, are we really going to claim that God didn't know then what we know now? I find that hard to believe about an omniscient God. I think that would be something he would know back then, that it's not a choice for a lot of people. And the last thing, which I don't have on here, is they'll say, well, what if this is natural to them? Isn't this how God wants them to behave, right? If they have this desire naturally. Well, I don't think that, Christianity definitely doesn't teach that we should satisfy every one of our bodily impulses. That's not Christianity, and that's not Judaism. So even if this is natural to people, which I think it is for some people, that doesn't follow from that that's how they should behave, right? For example, it's natural to men, I think, to not be monogamous, right? And most cultures throughout history are not monogamous. This is not man in his natural state to hitch himself to one woman and to be with her for the rest of his life. That's not natural man. Natural man is to impregnate many, many women. And even still, even post-Christian religions, they're always not monogamous, right? Or at least the big cases, right? Like Islam and Mormonism as well. It's like that's kind of the first thing people do when they start a new religion is they talk about all the different women that they can have now, right? Especially those that break from Christianity. So, yeah, this idea that because you have a natural desire, therefore it's from God and you should act on it, is not something that's going to be Christian. Christianity is always calling us to fight our natural impulses when they don't align with the will of God. That's part of being made as a rational animal, right? So we've got the animalistic parts, we've got our natural desire, but because we're rational, we have both the ability to say no to them and the ability to say yes to something greater, that of love. So what's the reason for this teaching? So let's just define marriage really briefly. So marriage is, this is according to the Catholic Church, an indissoluble, lifelong covenant between one man and one woman, established by God, aimed at the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of children. I love this too. I know we're not Anglicans here, but I just find it so beautiful. So the Church of England gives 3 reasons for why God institutes marriage. It's given for the mutual society, help, and comfort that man and wife should have from the other, both in prosperity and adversity. Secondly, marriage is given for the procreation of children, to be brought up in the fear and nurture of the Lord, and to the praise of his holy name. Thirdly, marriage is instituted as a remedy against sin and to avoid fornication, so that those, I don't like this translation here, but so that those who have not the gift of constancy might marry and keep themselves undefiled members of Christ's body. So basically, to run the race together with a co-pilot and to pick each other up and get each other to heaven, to give rise to offspring and to raise them in the faith for the glory of God and for the salvation of their souls. And thirdly, because we're animalistic and we're animals, and a lot of men cannot be celibate their whole lives. Most of us can't. And so therefore, since we're going to have sex, most of us regardless, might as well get married and have it in a non-sinful context. Paul talks about this in the scriptures, and we see this affirmed by the Church of England as well. So those are 3 reasons for marriage. So again, exploring this theme of marriage, what's the reason, what is the actual theology behind the heterosexual component to marriage? Well, it's supposed to mirror the relationship between Christ and his church. Again, we talked about how the relationship between God and his people is in spousal imagery. Well, there's an opposite sex component to that, right? There's an opposite sex component. Christ is not the church. Those two are not identical. They're different to each other. And so therefore, that has to be expressed in marriage as well. You need to have an element of difference there if that is the fundamental goal, right? Is to reflect that, that relationship which is itself different. And so you don't have Christ and Christ, or the church and church. So why would we have male and male or female with female? We're supposed to have that opposite sex dynamic there because it's complementarian at the end of the day. Also, we know from divine command. So ultimately, marriage is a sacrament that's instituted by God. And of course, sexuality, nature, and mankind is all from God. And so it's up to God how he wants to organize the universe and how he wants mankind to live. So why is something right or wrong? Partly because God commands us to do so, or God commands us not to do so, right? So we also know because it is the law of God. We can know from natural law too that sexuality has an opposite sex component to it, right? So this is the idea that right and wrong can be deduced from a close examination of human nature. So you can look at human nature to deduce how they should behave or how they ought to act, right? And so the whole reason why we have the sexual functions from a natural perspective, from an evolutionary perspective, is to propagate our DNA. And so that entails an opposite sex connection. So therefore, opposite sex is the reason why we have them. So we should act in accordance with that, not contrary to it. But then we have to always be cognizant of how we present this to progressive Christians or people that are sympathetic to people that struggle with same-sex attraction, which all should be, but people that are especially sympathetic to it or people that go through it themselves. Now, I wish I had more time today to talk about that, but yeah, maybe that's for a separate discussion. But basically, just kind of read what the Catechism says about this, that these people should be approached with compassion and love, and that every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard ought to be avoided. And I get this part from Matt Fradd, too. It's so brilliant. So whenever you're going to engage in a debate with a progressive Christian or somebody sympathetic to this philosophy about same-sex marriage, and they want to basically say that, oh, no, the Bible doesn't actually teach this about gay marriage. It doesn't teach that it's impermissible. Matt Fradd says, just cut through all the BS and ask them one question. If I can prove to you that the Bible does condemn this, would you actually change your mind on it? I think that's so powerful and so useful. And a lot of times they'll say no. I've seen people say no. And so if they say no, then you've got deeper issues to talk about. Fundamentally, the person doesn't trust God or the Bible and his church. And that's clearly the primary issue then that you need to talk to that person about, not interpreting the Bible. If don't even grant the Bible, don't even grant God's sovereignty. So use that question to cut through the noise and or cut through the smoke screen. And if they say, yes, they would change their mind, then you've opened them up, and now all of a sudden they have an open mind. I think they'll be more receptive to these arguments. But yeah, you always need to present it compassionately and find a way. This is the most helpful thing for me when I use this. Find a way to show the person that you're talking to that the person with same-sex attraction has more to gain by living the Christian life than he does by living the secular life. That on balance, that coming to know Christ in an intimate relationship on this earth and having that continue in heaven is much greater than, gratifying his desires and experiencing this type of pleasure on earth. So find a way to nail that home, that yes, Christianity takes from you, but it has way more to give to you. I found that especially helpful. So now we'll just talk about a multitude of different smaller issues in our time remaining, even though we're already over time here. So one charge of the progressive Christian is that the orientation of the Christian is horizontal over vertical. So what do I mean by these terms? So vertical orientation to the Christian life is one that places God and heaven at the center of his focus. So for example, the vertical Christian will incorporate and pay special attention to and put a lot of effort into a reverent liturgy. They'll spend a lot of time in prayer. They'll fast a lot. They'll be very theologically inclined. They'll repent to God, and they'll focus on sins against God. So blasphemy, going against the church, bad theology, all that stuff. Now, a horizontal orientation of the Christian life is one where the center, or one's focus, is on his neighbor in the world. So you'll see social justice, care for the poor, care for creation, animal rights, and then sins against neighbor. If you go to a horizontal parish, a lot of our hometown parishes are like this. My hometown parish, the one that's 2 minutes from my house, during the Confiteor, they won't even mention God when they begin the Confiteor in the prayer. So they'll say, brothers and sisters, they won't say brethren, right? They'll say, brothers and sisters, let's call to mind all the ways that we have let each other down and failed to love each other as we ought to. So no mention of God there. It's always each other. So that's kind of a classic horizontal approach. Now, I think that everyone is going to agree that an authentic and complete Christianity is going to encompass both, right? You're going to be both vertically and horizontally oriented. Even just looking at the Ten Commandments, right? The first three are God-centered or vertical. The latter seven are horizontal or other human being-centered, right? But is there a priority here? I think there is, contrary to the claim of the progressive Christian. Look at what Jesus says in Matthew. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. Other translations will say this is the greatest commandment. So we already know that that is the greatest. So it's kind of end of story here. That yes, obviously we should go all in on loving our neighbor and really serve the poor. But that isn't the fundamental orientation of the Christian life. We love God first before we love other people. Right? That is the Christian way. That is the greatest commandment. And then if you look at the Ten Commandments, our duties towards God are first. They're before the duties towards man. So there is a priority there. Next, they want to redefine Christianity oftentimes. So they'll redefine Christianity as a harbinger or vessel of moral truths and visions for a more just world. So Christianity isn't about redemption and salvation and fighting sin and prayer. All that stuff is all just symbols and metaphor and allegory to communicate moral truths to an ancient people. This is how they would understand it. But fundamentally, Christianity isn't about that. It's not about relationship with God. It's about creating a more just society here on earth. And so the true ends of man are not to be found in God himself, whatever that means, right? They won't think of God as a concrete particular that is sovereign over all creation, as a transcendent designer and creator much of the time. But they'll use that as just a placeholder for justice or for love or for equality, right? So they'll replace that with a desire for inner peace and self-fulfillment. For example, when I went to the press house and I went to their worship service, they took the classic hymn, There's a Wideness in God's Mercy, and they changed all the lyrics to it. Very interesting, and they made it all about the self. So you guys know how that song goes. First time I've ever sung in ministry defense, but it goes like, there's a wideness in God's mercy. We all know and love it. If you go to the press house, one of the hymns that they'll use is, they changed it, but still same tune. It goes, find your center, find your center. Can you feel how cringe that is, right? Look at to take all the focus off of God and they put it purely on the subject, purely on the self. People have described progressive Christianity as a weird wellness cult. And that changing the lyrics, I think, provides perfect attestation to that. But yeah, they view Christianity as a vehicle for social change. So if you hear a lot of Democratic Catholic politicians, there's this one phrase that they love to use. Ted Lieu, Gavin Newsom, Kathy Hochul, Nancy Pelosi, all of them, they all love to use this one phrase. They say, I'm a Matthew 25 Catholic. That's their favorite phrase. Matthew 25, of course, is the verse talking about, I was naked, you didn't clothe me. I was hungry, you didn't feed me. I was in prison, and you didn't visit me. I was sick, and you didn't nurse me. All that stuff, right? So clearly very horizontal, that passage. Because again, that's part of the gospel too, horizontal. But they'll call themselves Matthew 25 Catholics. There's such a great shame there, right? Like, why don't you want to be all gospel Catholics? Or why don't you want to be biblical Catholics? Why are you making your faith about one chapter of one book and really one passage of one chapter of one book? So I think clearly when you're going to say, I'm this one part of Christianity, you aren't really Christian then if that's what you're going to make your whole faith around. So how should Christianity actually be described and defined? Well, Orthodox Christianity is creation, fall, redemption, response, the story of salvation, and God's will for us now, coming to know Him and following His commandments. That is proper Christianity. There are three pillars of Christianity, as there are three pillars of every religion. This is according to the Catechism. Every religion has three components to it: creed, code, and cult. So what those adherents believe, how they live, and how they worship. That's going to be Christianity. Now, if you notice, the progressive Christians, I think they only focus on code or how they live, right? They only focus on morality, but that's not enough here. That's only one third of the faith. You also have to think about worship and liturgy, and you also have to think about belief and theology and what we actually think about God and His revelation. So I think they're practicing an incomplete version of Christianity, even just definitionally. We already saw that love of God is the highest commandment. And we also can see that from the Gospels that there are times when, at least in principle, there are greater goods than serving the poor or social justice. For instance, when Jesus is visiting the house of Lazarus' mother, Martha, and she pours this very expensive ointment on him. And then the disciples are scoffing at that, and they're saying, wait, why are you doing that? We could have sold this and given that money to the poor. And Jesus says, like, don't act like that. Don't worry about that. The poor you will always have with you, but I'm only here with you for a little while longer. So at least in principle, it's possible to venerate and honor God over give to the poor, at least in principle, right? That's at least possible. And so that shows that Christianity can't fundamentally or solely or exclusively be about social justice or service to the poor, if even Jesus contradicts that in principle. And also, too, to say that, these the language of redemption and salvation and sin and sacrifice is just kind of language used at getting at deeper moral truths towards right conduct towards each other and fairness and love and all of that, that clearly doesn't pay homage to the biblical data. The New Testament authors are just going to great lengths and struggling to figure out who Jesus is and their role in salvation and how they can be saved, right? So clearly, at least the New Testament authors don't agree with the progressive Christians on the goal of the faith. So kind of breeze through the rest here, right? So can conservative Christians be too vertical? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I know people in my life, and I've had phases where I've done this too, where like you could nerd out about liturgy and theology all day, but just completely neglect the poor, neglect service. Now that's as anti-Christian as the other way of doing it. So yes, we can be too vertical, and maybe having progressive Christians is healthy for us. There's some good that God can bring out of that heresy, in that it calls us to be more grounded in a complete version of Christianity. Another thing, this part's fun. Ugly churches. They love ugly churches. Just brief aside, does anybody know what church that is? I'd be surprised. But yeah, that's the Newman Center at Yale, actually. So think about that, right? Think about how ugly that church looks. But yeah, the case for ugly churches goes something like this. It's fundamentally, Bishop Barron talks about this, it's a movement from the spiritual to the material, from the heavenly to the worldly. So they'll want an emphasis on simplicity in poverty. They'll see the church as the people, not about the building, so what matters is the congregation. They'll say it's important to be like the world. This is really important for the Catholic churches, right, that come about after an interpretation of Vatican II, right? We always say Vatican II isn't the problem, it's the implementation of it, it's the interpretation of it. You see all these ugly churches come up, right, in the 70s, even through today a lot of the time, right? But thankfully these are going away. But what was the fundamental reason for having them in the first place? It was for Christians to blend in with the world. It was so we don't stand apart. That was the whole message, was to be like the rest of the world. And they'll even say, like, look, the Gothic architecture were reflections of the architectural philosophies at that time, so why not do this with the brutalist and simple architectures of our time? And also they want to react against triumphalism, this idea that, oh, we Christians are better than everyone else, or we have triumph, or we have it right and everyone else has it wrong. They want to stand against all of those. And there's a lot more to say, but we'll skip through everything. So that's the case for ugly churches. Let's look briefly at the case for beautiful churches. Let's look at the difference between those two, right? It's just so unbelievably stark. How can you just on a human level prefer the former to the latter? But anyways, what we'll say is that beauty reflects the glory of God. Pretty self-explanatory. So far from us wanting to be like the rest of the world, we should want to stand apart from the rest of the world, because Jesus and the reality of him is so contrary to what we get from the world. And this is fundamentally what we were made for. And if God is beauty itself, which we believe as Catholics, then why not reflect that in our structures that we erect to worship him in? So we think that they should visibly differ from ordinary buildings. We also think that sacred spaces should elevate the mind towards the divine. They should get you out of the world and get you thinking about heaven. And that's what classical church architecture does. Whether it's Gothic, with high ceilings that forces you to raise your mind to heaven, or Baroque styles which convince you of the reality that heaven has come down to earth in the person of Jesus, gets your eyes on heaven and off of the world. Also, we think that what's happening in church fundamentally than Mass, and what's happening at Mass other than the king entering into a palace. And so the king should be able to enter into a palace, not something that looks like a concrete like rec room. So the church should be beautiful just on those grounds alone. But also, too, what progressive Christians and Catholics fail to realize is that beautiful churches are fundamentally for the poor. Father Tim, you should talk about this. If you're a rich person, you don't need a church to experience beauty. You can fly first class on Emirates. You can stay at the Four Seasons. You can build a mansion on Long Island. You can do all sorts of nice things. You don't need this for luxury. But if you're a poor person, oftentimes the only experience you're going to have with something really grand or nice is a church. And I find that so cool, right? That you can be poor and really not have a great life in this world and really be missing out on a lot. But you can go to church and then have this reminder that heaven is so much greater than this world. And you get that from the church being heavenly. So they're fundamentally for the poor, because rich people can get nice things anywhere. But a church is the only place that a poor person can get something nice. And a church is actually the only place where like you're going to see rich and poor alike standing next to each other. They can go to different school systems, different universities, different neighborhoods, different everywhere, even different prisons, right? But in church, you're going to have a poor person kneeling next to a rich person. Again, talking about the beauty of the church, this is my favorite. This is at Notre Dame in Paris. Think about that. They want to strip that beauty from us in favor of plain and boring. It's so sad. That's why I fundamentally think it's actually demonically influenced to reject this in favor of something else. Anti-clericalism, we'll honestly just kind of skip this, but they want to draw a sharp distinction between the clergy and the laity, saying that the priest is fundamentally one of us. They should be kind of behaving with us as our pals, and we shouldn't be exalting them at all. But they're a transformed person, as we saw earlier. So no, we should be exalting them, and we should be deferring to their judgment much of the time. And hierarchy is not inherently negative. That's a fruit of modernity, this charge against hierarchy. But hierarchy is actually a good thing much of the time. And Christ establishes a hierarchy when he gives power to certain people and not others. And also heaven is a hierarchy, of course, right? So hierarchies aren't necessarily a bad thing. They'll argue for complete separation of church and state, so they'll say that Christianity should have no influence on the laws of a secular democracy. So for example, no laws against abortion, same-sex marriage, adultery, divorce, contraception, IVF, and more. Now, I'm somewhat sympathetic to this. I do think it's a hard line to draw, right? Because I think most of us here would say we're somewhere in the middle between those two opposites. Most of us aren't going to say that Christianity should have no influence on the laws, but most of us are also not going to say that you should be thrown in jail for blasphemy or something like that. Or you should be thrown in jail for missing Mass on a Sunday. It's a mortal sin, right? Most of us aren't going to say that. So we do lie somewhere on that spectrum. And while it is hard to pinpoint exactly where on that spectrum we should be, I think it's fair to say that that the one extreme, that it should have no influence, is wrong. And the church would definitely say that that's wrong. Pluralistic Christianity, we're nearing the end here. So the claim here is that Christianity is not the absolute truth for all people at all times. It's just one of many ways of coming to have a relationship with God or becoming a better person. It's one of many valid expressions of man's search for God. And so therefore, apologetics and evangelism are invalid and unnecessary, but even harmful exercises, because you're trampling over somebody else's truth, right? It's this idea that there is no the truth, there's just my truth and your truth. But when you do apologetics and when you evangelize, you're implicitly making a claim that there is the truth, and you want them to be in accord with that. And so they think that a claim to unique Christian truth is offensive and impermissible. And the response to this is that we should not look at Christianity as just a way of living life. This isn't just how I live life, but as the collection of creed, code, and cult. And reason reveals that only one religion can be true in this way. Especially when you look at theology, the different religions contradict each other on a lot. On the nature of God, on the nature of salvation, on the nature of relationship between God and man. So clearly they can't all be true. They are mutually exclusive. And different moralities and different ways of worship too. So you can't really say that all are equally valid, unless you're going to say they're all equally invalid. You can say that, but you can't say they're all equally valid because they contradict each other. Universalism. Universalism is defined as the view that every single person will eventually end up in heaven and union with God. So universalism is not a contradiction of hell. It's a contradiction of, or a denial of eternal conscious torment in hell. So it's denying the eternality of hell, not necessarily the existence of it. So the universalist, all he's really saying is that hell is not everlasting, and that no one will be there forever. And this is the part of progressive Christianity that I'm most sympathetic to of all, right? I really wish we didn't have to believe in eternal conscious torment. But as C.S. Lewis writes, there's no doctrine which I would more willingly removed from Christianity than this, speaking about hell, if it lay in my power. but it has the full support of Scripture, and specifically of our Lord's own words, and has always been held by Christendom, and it has the support of reason. So we have to. I think we all should not want hell. If you want hell, then I think you either don't love God or you don't love the people. So we all should not want it, right? At least this idea of everlasting hell. But our Lord warns us about it, and it makes sense with reason, so we have to hold it. And we'll talk extensively about hell the next meeting. The whole next meeting is about understanding hell and how we can make it more digestible and more palatable, and testing the limits that we can go while also being orthodox. Now, there's a potential pitfall to all this, which is tribalism. Yes, we have it right, and we have to say that as Catholics. We claim to have it right, but that doesn't mean that everyone else is a bad person or that we should look down on anyone else or that they're any lesser. We should love them and we should invite them into the fullness of truth, which is Catholic Christianity. So let's not view this as an us versus them mentality or have an excessive loyalty to our group. Let's view this as the Catholic Church as universal and meant for all, and kind of invite everyone else in, right? So we're not going to other anyone else. We're rather going to invite them in. We're not going to look badly on anyone else. And in fact, we can have the fullness of truth, but that doesn't mean we always live it out the best way. There are things we can learn from Protestants. There are things we can learn from Muslims even. Many Catholic theologians say that, like their devotion to God and praying 5 times a day. We can incorporate similar things to that. The Protestants reading the Bible a lot or evangelizing a lot. We've stolen a lot of their techniques, right? Focus is the biggest Catholic evangelism group, and their model of win, build, send, which is their whole ministry structure around that, comes from Campus Crusade for Christ, which is a Protestant org. So we can definitely learn from everyone else. Don't think that because we have it right, that everyone else has it completely wrong. In fact, the Church says there are kernels of beauty and truth in every tradition. So what does the world think of everything we've talked about today? Well, they disagree with pretty much all of it. They disagree with heaven and with God and with sacrifice. And they put everything in the context of the world and kind of living it up for the world. They say that we're discriminatory. They say that we're hateful. They say that we're bigoted. And as you use this material in evangelism, whether that's in a class or with other Christians, they will revile you. They will utter every kind of evil against you. They will cast you out. They will other you, and you will suffer persecutions against their name. Right? You will be against the world because the world is against all of this. And life will be more difficult at times, and you may have to make sacrifices. But in the words of Saint Athanasius, if the world is against the truth, then I'm against the world. Thank you all very much.